My name is Dr. Katherine Weintraub. I am the professor of saxophone at the University of South Florida and also at Southeastern University. In addition, I'm also a private instructor of saxophone in Tampa, Florida. So today I will be both performing and teaching the middle school saxophone Allstate excerpts. So I will be starting today with the lyrical excerpt. This is from the Rubank Advanced Method Volume 1, page 30, number 12, marked Larghetto. I'll be starting with this lyrical excerpt. When first learning this etude, I would suggest practicing with a metronome as often as you possibly can. Even though it is a slow etude and it's lyrical and playing expressively is also important, we want to make sure that the pulse remains steady and clear throughout the entire etude. We also want to make sure that you are subdividing all of the quarter notes that are tied to eighth notes, that you're properly subdividing those to ensure that the length is there for those notes. It may be helpful to actually play the subdivision for a while. So anytime you see a quarter note followed by an eighth note, actually play 3 eighth notes in there just to make sure that you're really feeling that subdivision. I'm going to demonstrate just in the first measure. So playing 3 eighth notes so you can get used to how that subdivision lies. And then once you're used to it, going ahead and playing the etude as written. Pitch is also or tuning is also something that's going to come up in an etude like this. We have a lot of middle C sharps in here, which tend to be flat, especially in comparison to your middle D, which tends to be sharp. You may think about employing some kind of corrective fingering for middle C sharp. I usually recommend for alto using the 3rd finger in octave key. As you can see, that helps bring up the pitch for that, what's usually a flat note. And on tenor and baritone, and also alto, another fingering that works well is just using the side C key. As you can see, that also helps bring up the pitch. So experiment with either of those fingerings on your horn. The 3 in octave key one usually just works for alto, but if, so also experiment with the side C key. See what works best in terms of helping to make the pitch of that C sharp a little bit better. We also just want to make sure that the C sharp has a good tone to it. C sharp tends to be kind of a more out of control note on the saxophone. So make sure that you aren't overblowing on that note and that you're trying to make its timbre or tone quality match to the D's that are right next to it. If I were to just let that C sharp go, it doesn't sound so good. So just being really careful to match the timbre of that C sharp to the D's that are right next to it. Of course, you also want to make sure that the accidentals in this etude carry through the measure. For example, on the first measure of the third line, make sure that that E flat carries through the measure. In the fifth measure of the fourth line, this is probably the trickiest measure of the etude, at least technically. First, I would recommend isolating the 16th note figure a little bit slower, and then adding the grace note in later and making sure that it's in time with the metronome. That A to C right there, make sure that your finger's coming off the octave key in time, and also that you're using your air from the A to the C to ensure that that interval is nice and smooth. So that just may be something that you want to isolate and practice on its own. You'll also want to adhere to all of the articulation markings in this etude. So learn the articulations as you're learning the notes and rhythm. That's going to be really important. But make sure that the overall style of the etude is nice and legato. Lastly, if this is something that you're starting on with your teacher or want to start on your own, vibrato can be a very useful tool with which to add expression to this etude. So just by barely changing the pitch up and down on a given note, using the embouchure, okay, by loosening the lips on the reed a little bit, this is how vibrato is done, and this can be a really useful tool to add expression to the etude. If you want, you can employ some kind of vibrato warm-up as a part of your practice routine in order to find the appropriate width and speed that would fit the vibrato for this etude. So as you can see, that adds just a nice, element of expressivity to this etude that wasn't there without the vibrato. So those are just some tips and tricks for the middle school saxophone lyrical etude. I'll now be demonstrating the technical etude. I will now be teaching and performing the middle school technical etude for saxophone. When working on this etude, you of course will want to start at a nice, slow, comfortable tempo and build up the tempo gradually to make sure that the technique is nice and clean. You'll also want to practice with the metronome as early as possible in the process of learning this etude and keep that up so that way the pulse always stays consistent. This etude is in the key of B minor, or B harmonic minor to be exact, and we see lots of A sharps in this etude. As we know, A sharp is the same thing as B flat. For the B flats or A sharps in this etude, I would recommend using the side fingering, which is A plus this side key right here. That's going to be the most efficient fingering to ensure a smooth technique, so I would practice implementing that. Of course, you are going to want to isolate certain measures of this etude over others because certain are just more trickier than others. So, for example, the first measure of the second line, that's a kind of a tricky measure right there, so practice it slower than the others and then gradually build the tempo up. Also, the measures with the low Bs, those are tricky as well. Particularly in the way of getting that low B to respond. So in order to get a low B to come out nice and clear, of course you're going to want to make sure that you're using a lot of air on that note. You also might think about just slightly loosening the embouchure, as in bringing the bottom lip just a teeny tiny bit away from the reed. And then lastly, you'll want to think of having a nice open, relaxed throat for this note to come out. So think of the vowel ah. That'll open up the throat and get this low B to speak a little bit clearer. You are also going to want to make sure that in bars where there are lots of articulated notes right next to one another, that the tongue is lined up with the fingers. So that again goes for those low B bars. Making sure that the fingers and the tongue are coordinated, and then also making sure that we're tonguing very lightly, using just the tip of the tongue on the tip of the reed. We also get a couple of measures with some E sharps, which are the same thing as F natural. If you're comfortable, I would practice employing the alternate F sharp fingering, which is using your ring finger right here, for those measures. If this isn't something you're comfortable with, don't worry about it, but it could be something that could make your technique a little bit smoother. Lastly, you're going to want to make very clear dynamic changes in this etude. So for example, in the second half where we start on that low B, we get forte for 2 bars, piano for 2 bars, forte for 2 bars, piano for 2 bars. So make sure that these dynamic changes are really clear and well executed. So those are just some tips and tricks for the middle school Allstate saxophone etudes. I hope this helped, and happy practicing.